Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Chris, and you already know reason for believing. Today, tonight, I'm giving my reason for what I believe in on a very controversial topic, and it just happens to be one of those things that I heard someone speak about. Didn't really think about it for a while, and then all of a sudden decided I got to figure out what's true and what's not. And it led me into my own study. I'm not looking at anyone else's perspective on this, anything like that. I'm literally just going by my own findings here. So, that being said, I basically did a chapter summary of the book of Acts. And the book of Acts to me was one of those books that I was kind of just like, I know it's in there. It was, you got the Acts 2, right? And then you've got, the apostles were getting a little persecution. And the gospel was going out, though, and people were getting saved. And, then you had Paul and, his conversion and his story. And then you have basically just the gospel going out. That's kind of like how I looked at Acts. And I'm amazed at all of the things that are in there that I had no clue about. But, I've read it multiple times. And it's just, I don't know what it is. But Yah's word is powerful, and it's always active and doing different things at different times. So praise Yah, and I'm just going to share my summary of the book of Acts. And I called it the Acts of Antinomianism. And if you're unfamiliar with that word, I'm not going to talk too much about it in this. I'm just going to wait until hopefully tomorrow I can do the other video that I want to do about this. But regardless, this is it. It's a chapter by chapter summary of the book of Acts. Chapters 1 through 10. Luke is writing this book to Theophilus. And he wrote the gospel according to Luke to Theophilus as well. And so I think it's kind of important that we figure out who this guy is, right? It means friend of God, right? Friend of Yah. And but it kind of seems out of place, that there's names are in there for a reason. If there's a name in the Bible, usually you can figure out who that person is, right? So I did a little digging, and during the Herodian or Roman period, there was a high priest, and it was like a whole family line of high priests, like all the at least the last groups of high priests, they were all like related for the most part. And there's one down here that had the position for 37 to 41, and that would be 4 years roughly after Messiah's death, right? And so it seems to me that this would be a good fitting person to fit this role, the high priest, right? Luke is gathering eyewitness accounts to detail his findings and present them to the high priest. To me, that just makes sense. But it even says it in here. He was the high priest. Theophilus was the high priest in the second temple in Jerusalem from 37 to 41. He was a member of the wealthiest and most influential Jewish families in the Judean province, which would make him a Herodian, and we'll get into that. But during the first century, growing but still uncommon belief points to this person as the person whom the Gospel of Luke is addressed, but Theophilus is a common enough name that there are many other possibilities of the addressee of Luke's Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles. Okay, so even right here on Wikipedia, it says, hey, this is a thought that people have. This is a conclusion that people have come to, that this guy could be the one. And it's interesting, and I just realized that he is a Herodian. But we'll get into that, what that means here shortly. the Messiah had a lot of not nice things to say about the Herodians, and he even called King Herod, a fox, which is, I don't know what that equates to in our language, but sure it's not nice. Regardless, we have the opening statement, Luke to Theophilus. Then you have the picture of the 11 apostles. Then Matthias is added to make the 12. They're all waiting for the promise of the set-apart Spirit. The Spirit comes, Peter preaches, people listen, 3,000 are added. All right, they're all in one accord. They have all things common. Peter and John go out to heal and preach. They're interrogated by the Sadducees. They keep preaching. People come and give all they had to follow the apostles. They would come and lay down everything that they had and give it all to them, and then they would distribute it as needed. And it was a very, very good system that they had in the beginning. Barnabas is first mentioned, and this could possibly be Matthias. I didn't pull it up or have information about it, but there's a lot of different theories on who Barnabas and what happened to Matthias. But it also makes sense to me that they added an apostle, and then he's never mentioned again. But this guy Barnabas just so happens to come on the scene like immediately afterwards. So it makes sense to me again that Barnabas could be Matthias. Matthias is Barnabas. All right. So we have Ananias and Sapphira are taken out. The high priest comes with Sadducees and put the apostles in prison for preaching and healing, and the angel of Yah releases them to go preach. So they came and found them preaching. They warned them again, and they sought to kill the apostles. And Gamaliel says to leave the apostles alone. If it's of Yah, it's something that Yah's doing, it'll stand, and there's nothing they can do about it. But if it's false, then it won't stand, and just kind of let it, fizzle out, right? It's interesting that Gamaliel is the person who says this, and the high priest and the Sadducees listen to him. So I'm like, is this the same Gamaliel that Paul talks about? And that Paul said, this was his teacher, right? Well, this guy Gamaliel, they call him Gamaliel the Elder. He was the first person to be given the title Rabban, which is like higher than rabbi. So they really put this guy up there, and he was a leading authority in the Sanhedrin in the first century. His father was a great Jewish teacher as well. He was a Pharisee, and so on. So you can read about Gamaliel, and he was in the Sanhedrin, and in the New Testament, including the Gospels in relation to the trial of Yahusha, in the Acts of the Apostles, which means a great Sanhedrin, where Rabbi Gamaliel appeared, the stoning death of Saint Stephen. So the Sanhedrin was like Sanhedrin, whatever. They were a council, right? It was the 70 elders that Moses appointed way back in the day that has continued on. So they were, involved in numerous different things, but it no longer became like they kind of started to rule, like certain things they put in place the high priest, and they started to take a little bit of control over some things. But anyways, regardless of all that, just interesting to note that this Gamaliel is the same person, and he just happens to be one of the high ups in the Sanhedrin, if not the leader of the Sanhedrin and the high priest, or excuse me, not the high priest. That was all right. Where are we at? So they keep preaching everywhere because Gamaliel gave him some space, basically, which is interesting. But the Greeks debate with the Hebrews because their widows are neglected. And this is something that we just, no, I've never heard anybody explain this before. So I figured out why that there was an issue and it goes back to a Torah commandment, and it is in Ezekiel 44, and it talks about having foreigners in the assemblies, like in the sanctuaries, in the temple, in the synagogues. So this is Ezekiel 44, verse 6. It says, "You shall say to the rebellious, even to the house of Israel, thus saith Yahweh Elohim, O you house of Israel, let it suffice you of all your abominations, in that you have brought into my sanctuary strangers, uncircumcised in heart and uncircumcised in flesh." Yes, this is the Old Testament speaking like this. Uncircumcised in heart and uncircumcised in flesh. Strangers are in my sanctuary, and they're polluting it. And even in my house, when you offer my bread and when you do sacrifices, you've broken my covenant because of all your abominations, and you have not kept the charge of my holy things, but you have set keepers of my charge in my sanctuary for yourselves. Thus saith Yahweh Elohim, no stranger uncircumcised in heart, nor uncircumcised in flesh, shall enter into my sanctuary, of any stranger that is among the children of Israel. So it was a big deal, and there was a thing called Hellenistic Judaism. And Hellenistic Judaism had its roots in an interesting place in Antioch. And we'll see Antioch come up quite often in Acts. And it was basically a mixing of Greeks and Jews, and it was very prevalent in some areas, and it brought into this thing where strangers, Gentiles, would come into the synagogues and stuff and try to be part of it. And there was an issue with the high priest and stuff, like accepting payments from these strangers and things. So there was a lot of things going on in the background that I've figured out just by researching. So yeah, interesting stuff. So because the Greeks debate with the Hebrews, their widows are neglected. The Hebrews actually consented with them, and they said, okay, these people were not strangers anymore. They were no longer uncircumcised in heart or in flesh, right? They were brought into the customs and into the relationship of the same relationship that these Jews had with the Most High. So they were no longer strangers and foreigners in the synagogue, and in the temple and in Yah's kingdom, right? So they select 7 men to serve while the apostles were dedicating themselves to preaching and prayer. Some sects came and started to argue with Stephen, and they're very specific groups of Pharisees that names like where they were from, and it's interesting. Like the first part of Acts is like very detailed on who the people are, and I'll explain some of that in just a little bit. But Stephen puts them in their place. They stone him, and they bring his clothes to Paul, who consented to his death. And probably Gamaliel was there as well, because of what we just read. And this is the first time that Paul is actually mentioned by name. Paul wreaks havoc on the disciples, taking many to prison. The disciples scattered from Jerusalem except the apostles. They were the only ones who remained. Philip preaches in Samaria. Philip is the first one to really show signs and miracles. Peter and John go to check on him. And this is where the first Gentiles received the Spirit. So it's interesting because Peter still has an issue with Gentiles, right? Understanding the relationship between the Gentiles. But it says that while Peter, John, and Philip are in Samaria is when the Gentiles first received the Spirit. And it's interesting that it's in Samaria too. But Philip finds the eunuch. He explains Isaiah and baptizes him. Paul pursues the disciples with threatenings and slaughter. Paul goes to the high priest, and when on the road to Damascus, he has his encounter. Paul goes to Ananias. Paul receives his sight, he's baptized, and went to synagogue to preach. Paul goes to Jerusalem to the disciples, and Barnabas takes Paul to the apostles. So immediately, the first thing that we're told happened when Paul comes to Jerusalem. Did he really all the way go down on the way? Come on, man. Is as soon as they get to Jerusalem, Paul has a dispute with the Grecians, and they want to kill Paul. It's like, huh? The Hebrews, the Hebrews who are, I'm assuming those are the apostles and their disciples. They had a dispute with the Greeks, and everything was cool. They appointed people over them to help in administration and whatnot. But Paul comes on the scene, and right away he disputes with the Greeks, and they want to kill him. I'm like, what? That's really interesting. And it says, this is when the terminology on some of the people start to get very vague. It says the brethren sent him to Tarsus. And we automatically assume who we think the brethren are. And this is not the only instance that I'm going to reference, but it's just a starting point for this anomaly in the titles and names that are used for certain people, and it kind of leaves you wondering who these people actually are. But regardless, it says the brethren took him to Tarsus, which is where Paul was from. So when Paul leaves Jerusalem, it says that the churches in Judea, Galilee, and Samaria had rest and were edified. Okay. Peter went around to the churches that they had been setting up and that have been progressing and whatnot, and he stopped at Lydia. This is where Peter heals, and he turns many to the Most High Yahuwah, and he raised Tabitha from the dead. Then you have the meeting with Cornelius, and Peter has his vision. Cornelius and people are added. Peter preaches the witness of Messiah. Gentiles were brought in, and circumcision, Jews are amazed in a good way. They see that Gentiles are brought in. And this is in a different area, right? This is in Lydia. So Peter goes to Jerusalem, and the Jews, another, questionable kind of term. I mean, we kind of assume who, we think that we know who he's talking about. But at the same time, there's, people make a division between, in Jerusalem, Jews that are still Pharisees, Jews that are believing Jews in the Messiah, and other kinds of Jews, and you know what I'm saying. So, like, which Jews is this talking about? So you kind of have to read in context and really see people, the people that it's talking about, their reaction to certain things, to try to judge who these people, who this is referring to. So Peter goes to Jerusalem, and the Jews confront him for staying with the Gentiles. See, there's still this misunderstanding of Jews and Gentiles, right? And it also shows, how they had that separation, and we don't get that a lot. Israel's supposed to be separated from the world. You know what I'm saying? So they did that. They rebelled, obviously, and they didn't do a very good job in some ways, many ways. But they still had a separation of themselves from Gentiles and Gentile ways of doing things. Not like today. And I'm not talking about Jews. So Peter explains his vision, and these Jews glorify Yahuwah because the Gentiles have been given repentance unto life. So the Jews are glorifying the Most High because Gentiles have been brought into the family. And they're like, yeah. So the scattered disciples, the ones that left when Paul came to Jerusalem, they started preaching. They were preaching to the Jews only. But now it was going to the Greeks, who were starting to believe. So Barnabas goes to Tarsus for Paul, and they go to Antioch for a year. So the apostles send out Barnabas, and Barnabas goes to Tarsus to grab Paul, and they go to Antioch. They're first called Christians in Antioch, where Peter and Barnabas are, and where there's a big kind of like a meshing pot of different groups of people, especially in a religious political sense. But they go to Antioch for a year. They're first called Christians. Prophets from Jerusalem come. There had been a famine in the land, and the people from Antioch sent relief money to Judea, which is interesting because Judea is where the Herodian dynasty emanates from. That King Herod is, they call, King of the Jews. He was based out of Judea. So these prophets from Jerusalem come, don't know who they are. They're not apostles, right? So we don't know who the prophets are, but they said that they've come from Jerusalem because there's a famine, and the people in Antioch send relief money to Judea. There's some interesting things about that, but I'm not going to get into that right now. So Barnabas and Paul, and they were sent to deliver it. They didn't go; they were sent by the prophets to deliver it. Interesting. They're sent out in another place too, and I'll get into that a little bit more because that's really interesting. So while they're in Judea, King Herod started to vex certain disciples, and he has James, John's brother, killed. Not Messiah's brother, John's brother, killed. And it says that this pleased the Jews, so he went after Peter. So here we go again with the quote Jews. Which Jews? Who Jews? Unbelieving Jews, Pharisee Jews, Herodian Jews, like which Jews? But it says that this pleased the Jews. It can't be the Jews that were just glorifying the Most High, right? Because the Gentiles were brought in. Because they would be the ones that are being, they're part of the apostles, right? So it can't be those Jews. So which Jews? This was during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So they captured Peter. The disciples are in constant prayer. The angel of Yah breaks Peter out of prison again, and Herod turns into worms. So I think this is a turning point right here, because certain people worshipped the Herodian dynasty. If you don't know anything about it, do some research because it's pretty wild. It was a whole family affair. It was like a Bush dynasty, you know what I'm saying? Only to another level. They would worship, that's why he turned into worms, because people were worshiping him as the Messiah, right? And you can't do that. You'll turn into worms. But anyways, so the Herodians are the most prominent group of the Jews, right? Political Jews. That's what they were. But anyways, so Barnabas and Paul return to Antioch, and they take with them John Mark. There's prophets and teachers in Antioch that were brought up with King Herod and Paul. So this is a direct reference to Paul being a Herodian. Now this is where it gets really interesting. So it's like, okay, you see him in Judea taking money, but I thought the famine was in Jerusalem. So the king lives in Judea. Shouldn't money go to maybe the people in Jerusalem that would need it? I don't know why the money would be taken to Judea, to where the Herodians live. Now, I'm not saying the Herodians are the only ones that live there, but we see right here that Paul was raised with King Herod, And I'm not going to get into it now, but Paul's mother is directly involved. Directly involved. Like, very directly involved. And yeah, I'm not going to get into that right now. That's for tomorrow. Paul and Barnabas are sent to preach. Here's the second time where we see that they don't go out on their own, that Paul and Barnabas are sent to preach by the prophets and teachers that are in Antioch. And they went to the synagogue. They came across Bar Jesus. This is very interesting. It says that he was a false prophet. He was a Jew, a false teacher, a false prophet, and Paul rebukes him. There's no details whatsoever on what was said or what happened. To me, that's crazy. To me, that's like, come on, really? You're going to put something like this in here and not give any details on what happened or what was said? It's just a word that was used to describe this person. Well, whose word? You know what I'm saying? Like, if you can't give any details, then what's the point of having it in there? But regardless of that, no details on what was said or what happened, but Paul blinds him. Because that's my thing. I'm like, well, if Paul had the, audacity to blind someone, I want to know why. And I'm not trying to, I just want an answer. Is that so much to just want an answer for why somebody blinded somebody else? So they traveled around more, and John Mark leaves. He goes to Jerusalem. And we find out in another area, Paul does not like this. Paul does not like when somebody leaves him. He didn't have anything nice to say about John Mark. But regardless, Barnabas and Paul go back to Antioch. Paul's in the synagogue, and Paul quotes Habakkuk. And to me, I saw this and I was like, are you kidding me right now? And you may just, not be familiar enough with the book of Habakkuk, but I recently, I spent a great deal of time in Habakkuk studying, and I really enjoy that book. Like, that's on top of the list. It's only 3 chapters, right? Very small, but the content, the message of it, the first chapter. Okay, well, this is what Paul says. Paul's talking to the Jews that aren't receiving his message, that are in the synagogue. And he says, behold, you despisers, and wonder and perish, for I will work a work in your days which you shall in no wise believe, though a man declare it to you. So he was rebuking the unbelieving Jews because they were not accepting his message, and he quotes Habakkuk to them. But when you read Habakkuk and you understand what it's talking about, I believe it's talking about the 144,000, the 2 witnesses, the end times remnant, that whole scene. Because what he says is, he says, behold you among the heathen. And because Habakkuk's like, everything's crazy. All the people are forsaking your Torah and your commandments, and everything's just crazy. And what are you going to do about this? I'm surrounded. I see all this. You cause me to behold iniquity all day long. When are you going to do something about all this crazy stuff that's going on right now? Like right now, right? And he says, Habakkuk, chill out, man. Behold you among the heathen. Behold you among the heathen. You, Nazarene. Behold you among the heathen. And regard and wonder marvelously, for I will work a work in your days which you will not believe, though it be told to you. I did a 2.5-hour video compiling like a bunch of the prophets and talking about the 2 witnesses and all that, and that's what it's talking about right here in Habakkuk. It's this uplifting message to stand strong, to continue keeping the commandments, and Yah is going to do a crazy thing. But Paul uses it to rebuke people for not accepting his message, and I saw that. I was like, No, 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 no. That's wrong. That's wrong. That's not right. There's something wrong with that. There's something very wrong with that. But I'm just going to continue. Many Jews and proselytes followed Paul. Proselytes were the Gentile converts to Judaism that were not allowed to be in the temple, probably, for the most part, because the whole system had been corrupted, by and large. But it says that some Jews were zealous and moved with fervor of spirit against Paul because he was contradicting and blaspheming. Whoa. Okay. Man, we see another group of people that wanted to kill him, and we see these people. It says they were zealous, and there was a group of people called the Zealots. And remember, we have an apostle that was called the Zealot, right? So the Zealots, do some research on who the Zealots were, but they were actually the complete opposite to a lot of these other groups that we talk about. The proselytes, the Herodians, they were the legit ones, right? But some Jews were zealous or zealots and moved with fervor of spirit. See, in the King James, it uses a different word that makes it sound, I can't remember what it is right now, but it makes it sound like they were bad. The Jews were bad. They were in the wrong for doing what they were doing. But when you read the actual word, you have to look up every single word. I look up every single word to see what it means. Even when it says the, whatever, that one doesn't even come up, but whatever. It says they were moved with fervor of spirit against Paul because he was contradicting and blaspheming. I'm like, whoa, really? I don't remember reading that one. But Paul tells the Jews that they are rejecting everlasting life and he is now going to the Gentiles. So Paul says he's now going to the Gentiles. Paul continued, so Jews, he wouldn't leave, so the Jews got devout and honorable women and chief men and raised persecution against Paul and Barnabas and forced them to leave. Oh. Paul, Barnabas, and their disciples go to Iconium, went to the synagogue to preach. Jews and Gentiles are starting to believe. Again, we see these Jews and Gentiles in the synagogue. It's just interesting to note these things, right? So the unbelieving Jews, quote unquote unbelieving Jews, unbelieving in which way, which message, which doctrine? We don't know. But we just assume that we know, but we're not told. So the unbelieving Jews stirred up Gentiles to see Paul as evil. So they went to another place, and it's like everywhere he goes. Everywhere that Paul goes, he has people that he just creates a ruckus. The city was divided, half with Paul and half with the Jews, quote-unquote Jews. So the Jews and Gentiles sought to stone Paul and their followers, so they left. We're in Acts 14 through 17. Barnabas and Paul first referred as apostles by Luke, unless Barnabas, unless he's Matthias. So people call them gods, but Paul tells them to turn to the Creator. Oh yeah, in Iconium, I think it was in Iconium. Real interesting. Paul gives like this message, and it's just really interesting some of the things that he says. But regardless, he doesn't talk about Messiah or anything. He just records that he tells them that there's a Creator, something like that. I don't know. It's just kind of strange. But regardless, the Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and persuaded the people and stoned Paul, but his disciples raised him up and went with Barnabas to Derbe. So the Jews that were just in Antioch and Iconium, unless this is Iconium, I can't remember, but they came from another area they persuaded the people and they stoned Paul, and we don't know if he killed them or if they just injured him, and the disciples raised him up like we think that it's a raising from the dead. and it could be like, hey, you just got knocked in your head with a rock, homie, get up, you know. So they're in Derbe, and they went to set up leaders in all their churches. So they went around to a bunch of places, and they returned to Antioch. So obviously Antioch is their headquarters. There's lots of different things that you could research and learn about Antioch. It's always good to learn about these cities and what was going on in there. So men from Judea came to Antioch and told people to be circumcised. And they argued with Paul and Barnabas, and the Jews told them to go to Jerusalem to the apostles and elders. So there was a dispute with Paul and some men from Judea, and Paul listened to the men from Judea, and they went to the apostles and elders, and they were received, right? They brought them in and were talking to them, and there was a debate about the circumcision and about the Torah, the commandments, and not just the 10 commandments. We're talking about the Torah, the commandments, feast days, Leviticus 8:11, eating clean, all those types of things. There was a debate about those things and circumcision. And so Peter speaks, Paul and Barnabas speak, and James speaks. And James has the final authority on what's going to happen, right? James is the leader. We all assume that Peter is the leader of the church, but in practicality, we see James being mentioned as the head of the church. And so right here we have James. So James says, look, the Torah is preached and read all over in every city on every Sabbath day. So he's like, there's no reason why everybody can't hear the message of the Torah, right? And the message of the Torah obviously is to circumcise the flesh and to be circumcised in the heart, right? And to keep all the commandments. So he says the Gentiles can come in to the synagogues to hear this message and to learn and to obey. They need to abstain from idols, from fornication, from things strangled, from eating things that have been strangled, and from blood, right? And again, we come to this. Let me see where it's at. The polluting the sanctuary. They're saying we can't pollute the sanctuary with strangers that are uncircumcised in heart and uncircumcised in flesh, right? So we want to have these people circumcised in the heart and in the flesh so that they can come into, an understanding of the Torah, because that was James's whole point. He's saying that the Torah is preached all over every week. You come on Shabbat and you can hear the Torah preached, the whole thing, right? So that was the consensus, and so that's what they agreed upon. That's what James said was going to go down. And let's see where we're at. So the Gentiles needed to do these things, and they sent Paul and Barnabas away with Silas. So they give Paul Silas, and Silas is Silvanus. There's a lot of names that are the same people in the book of Acts. Do your own research on that, but it's interesting just to note that, like, Silas is Silvanus, different names for the same people. Paul sends a letter out to these churches and whatnot, and he literally tells people not to keep the Torah, and it's like, huh? You guys just had this council, this, Jerusalem, Acts 15, Jerusalem council. The Gentiles don't have to do anything except for, abstain from idols and fornication, things strangled, and blood. And it's like, no, that's not what James said at all. That's the beginning. That's the introduction. Just like the Messiah says that, you have to have faith. Without faith, you can't have anything. So if you don't believe that Yahusha is the Messiah, how can you come and hear his message? That was his whole point of saying that thing. Like, if the Pharisees and stuff, they weren't listening to the things that he was talking about all the time. They were just trying to figure out how to trap him. It's because they didn't have any faith. If they had faith, they would come to him, right? They would come to him as the Messiah, and they would listen to what he had to say. They would come to him as the great teacher, and to listen to what he has to say. And you have to have faith to be able to come in and listen to the message. And that's James's whole deal. Obviously they already had the faith, but what they needed was to get rid of all the heathen Gentile traditions and all, these different things, so that they would not pollute the sanctuary. So, after Paul writes this letter, Paul and Barnabas immediately divided. Barnabas is like, no way. So what Paul said in his letter, you go read it for yourself. But Barnabas is immediately a divide. It says that the enmity between the two was like so sharp. It was like, it was about to go down. Barnabas was about to drop some bows. And so Paul and Barnabas immediately divided. Barnabas takes John, and Paul takes Silas, and they go opposite ways. They go around to the churches. Paul finds Timothy. Timothy is actually family to Paul. I don't know if y'all knew this, but when Paul says that I'm like your father, he's not too far off from that. It's his nephew, not niece. Timothy is definitely a boy's name. So Timothy is actually Paul's nephew, and he is the son of a very prominent woman. But that's another topic for maybe tomorrow. So they go around to the churches. Paul finds Timothy. He has circumcised because of the Jews, and all knew that Timothy's father was a Greek. Interesting. Just think about that stuff for a couple minutes. Right. So they couldn't go to Asia or Bithynia. They were like, stopped by the Spirit to do that. So Paul has a vision to go to Macedonia. He's accused of teaching the people customs that are not lawful for the people to receive or to observe, being Romans. I'm like, huh? Paul is a Roman. He's a Roman citizen. You will see that. So I'm like, what is it? What do they mean? What is... Okay. So they all rose up together against Paul and Silas and commanded them to be beaten. They were given many stripes and cast into prison. In prison there was an earthquake. All the doors were open and all their chains broken. The jailer believed Paul's message and helped Paul. Paul was treated unfairly, though. He felt like he was, he had gotten beaten for no reason. And he wanted to make it known that he was a Roman citizen. And they left for Thessalonica, and so they basically just let him go, They left for Thessalonica and went into the synagogue. Some believed, others were moved with zeal. Here we go, these zealots again. And they took some strong men in a crowd to get them, and they took them to the rulers of the city, saying, "These are the people that have turned the whole world upside down. Caesar is not king, only Jesus." All right? And the brethren sent away Paul and Silas to Berea, went to the synagogue, and the message was accepted. And it says that these were more nobles. And what it means is they were nobles. They were Herodian nobles, probably, for the most, though there would not be Roman nobles in this area, I don't believe, in the synagogue, right? It would be Herodian, nobility. Because they had a Jewish, lineage. The Jews came and stirred up the people. They sent Paul to leave, but Silas and Timothy stayed. Paul, this is, to me, I was like, what? Really? Oh, okay. I mean, it says what it says. I can't, there's no way around that. So we have, these nobles, these probably Herodians. The Jews came up and stirred up the people, so they sent Paul away. Who sent them away? To me, it sounds like the nobles sent Paul away. And to me, this is why it makes sense that they would be Herodians, because it says that Paul was brought to Athens by those who conducted him. And I was like, huh? So Paul was taken away. He was with these nobles. He was taken away, and he was brought to, a Roman city by those who conducted him. And conducted, look it up, find the verse, look it up. I can't do everything for you. You're going to have to do some research on your own. So Paul was brought to Athens by those who conducted him. And in our modern day terminology, it would be like a handler. That's the only thing that I can think of that would fit this word that's used. It's like, one who puts one in a position and basically guides him. That's a handler, a CIA handler, right? Very interesting. Go look up the word. So Paul, while they're there, Paul calls for Silas and Timothy. So, stupid computer. So Paul sees that Athens is in idolatry. Some philosophers came and wanted to hear Paul. Paul speaks, and he says, Yah overlooks idolatry because of ignorance. And I was like, huh? There's some things that he says in there. I'm just like, what? Some believed and followed Paul. Then you have Paul goes to Corinth and meets with Aquila and Priscilla, because he also was a tent maker by trade. When did Paul become a tent maker? I thought he was a Pharisee. I thought he grew up at the feet of Gamaliel. I mean, I guess you gotta eat, right? I just figured being a Herodian and being involved with King Herod and the Pharisees, that you wouldn't have to make tents to, get by. But regardless, just another thing that we're not, very clear on. Paul reasons with the Jews and the Greeks in the synagogue, and he's debating with them about something that we're not told. And to me, it just seems sketchy, because not in and of itself, but because of what comes after that. So they're debating about something. Okay, fine. But it says that when Silas and Timothy come, Paul was, quote, pressed in the spirit and testified Jesus to the Jews. So they were obviously talking about something else before Silas and Timothy show up. Because when Silas and Timothy show up, Paul changes what he's talking about, and it says that he's pressed in the spirit to testify Jesus to the Jews. And they didn't receive his message, so he said he was going to the Gentiles. Once again, says he's going to the Gentiles. A few chief men from the synagogue believed and were baptized. So Paul stays in Corinth for 18 months. A new leader comes in Achaia, so the Jews with one accord sought Paul and brought him to the leader to be judged. Paul was teaching to worship contrary to Torah. We don't know exactly, unless you go and read Paul's letters. You really don't know exactly how these things fit in when people bring up accusations, constantly bringing up accusations. Some things we can ascertain from just reading Acts, but other things we have to read his letters to see why people are saying what they're saying. But regardless, it says that Paul was teaching to worship contrary to the Torah. The new ruler would not hear the judgment. He's like, if it's about your laws, I'm not getting involved. So the Greeks, it says that the Greeks beat the ruler of the synagogue. Paul stayed for a while and then left with Aquila and Priscilla, and they went to Syria. Antioch isn't Syria. They probably went to Antioch. Paul had a vow, so he shaved his head. Okay. The only vow is a Nazirite vow, and the shaving of the head is part of the ending of the vow. But I don't know if this is a Nazirite vow. I'm not sure. And I say that because there were certain things that you had to do to end the Nazirite vow. So, yeah, I mean, it's not something that you do like subsequently. It's like, it's not one thing that happens and then maybe in a couple of months you go and do your offerings and those things. It was like, nah, if you end your vow, there's things that you do when you end your vow, and one of those things was to shave your head. So I don't know what that means. So Paul left them, and Paul left Aquila and Priscilla, and he went to Ephesus. So Paul went into the synagogue to reason with the Jews. Thought he was going to the Gentiles. They wanted to kill him. Or no, sorry. That's not always the case. Not everybody wants to kill him. They wanted him to stay, but he said that he had to go so he could keep a feast in Jerusalem. Now get this. So people wanted him to stay. He's like, nah, I gotta go. There's a feast in Jerusalem. I gotta get there. And you're like, oh, cool. Paul's keeping feasts, right? Not so much. He travels around for a while, and Apollos comes on the scene. Paul travels all the way back to Ephesus, and he stays for 3 months. It's like, huh? Some believed not and spoke evil of, quote unquote, that way, and separated the disciples, disputing daily in the school of Tyrannus, and this continued for 2 years. So Paul was in Ephesus in the school of Tyrannus, debating, disputing with disciples daily for 2 years. That's a long time to be disputing and debating with people. I don't dispute and debate with nobody anymore. I just share what I learned. That's it. I don't get down with the whole disputing and debating. But regardless, I'm not condemning anybody for disputing and debating. I'm just saying that's a long time to be doing that for. All in Asia heard the word of the Messiah, Jews and Gentiles, Greeks. So Paul starts miracles. Paul had not performed any recorded miracles up to this point. But his clothes, interesting, his clothes were brought to sick people, and diseases and evil spirits left them. I don't know, it sounds like Benny Hinn. The 7 sons of Sceva, we have that incident. People brought all their sorcery books and burned them. Paul wants to go to Jerusalem, then Rome, but stays a while. So Paul has it in his mind. He wants to go to Jerusalem, and he wants to go to Rome. Keep that in mind. So they have the Princess of Diana ordeal. They travel around and was at Philippi, after the days of unleavened bread. Paul was preaching for all night, and a man fell from the window, and they went down, raised him up. They left that town and went on the boat to Assos, but Paul walked there. That's interesting. There was like a whole group of people that were like, all following Paul, and they get on this boat to go to another town, and Paul's like, hey everybody, see you later, and he goes off and walks to the town. Like, okay, interesting. But regardless, they meet in the town, and they traveled around to many other places. In Acts 20, Paul talks a lot. Not going to really get into any of that. They traveled around more, was told by some disciples not to go to Jerusalem. So there were some disciples, don't know who they were, what they believed, anything like that. I don't know. Whose disciples? Paul's or, the James's. But regardless. So these disciples told him not to go to Jerusalem. So he was like, So he finally goes to Jerusalem, And Paul went to James, and all the elders were there. And all the elders would probably be the apostles, or perhaps the 7 elders that they had put in place, minus Stephen, who was stoned. Not too sure. But, so Paul basically has a face-to-face with the leader, James, the pillar. So James confronts him. Well, Paul gives an exhortation of his ministry first. He's like, oh, all these things are happening. And James says, oh yeah? He says, that's cool. I've got tens of thousands of believing Jews right here in Jerusalem. Tens of thousands. Jews believing. Not just Gentiles, but tens of thousands of believing Jews right here in Jerusalem. And he says, hey, everyone claims that you're teaching the Gentiles to forsake the Torah. And I've got all these Jews, tens of thousands of Jews, and they're saying these things. What's going on? And while James is having a face-to-face with Paul, it says that the Jews of Asia see him in the temple, and they laid hands on him, and they cried out to the men of Israel for help. This is the man that teaches all men against the people, against the Torah, and against the temple. And they went to kill Paul. And the chief captain sent centurions to check out what was going on, and people were beating Paul. Like, what? So, we think that, if we remember this scene, we think like, oh man, Paul got, this persecution, he's getting persecuted. People told him, don't go to Jerusalem, you're going to get persecuted. Paul had it in his heart, he's going to go to Jerusalem and then go to Rome. And he goes to Jerusalem and he gets beat up. I'm like, why? Why is Paul getting beat up? Well, we're told why. James, the leader, confronts him and says that everyone claims that he's teaching the Gentiles to forsake the Torah. And if Barnabas went back to Jerusalem, I think Barnabas would be included in the elders category and be included in one of the people who's claiming he's teaching Gentiles to forsake the Torah. Just an opinion. It makes sense, though. It's a good opinion. So the Jews of Asia grab him. They're beating him. The chief captain, what the Romans would do is they would set up, what do they call it? A watchman tower. I was going to use a jail term, but, anyways, so they had these watchtowers, right? And they would basically watch. And if something went down, send some people out to go handle the situation. So the chief captain saw that there was a ruckus, and they sent some people out to go see what was going on. They took Paul, and there was so much commotion, people were beating him, so they took Paul and put him in double chains. The people were divided on who he was, so they took him away. Obviously, the chief captain were like, who is this guy? And then everybody was like, rabble, 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 rabble. Right? And so they took him away. He's like, whatever, we're not dealing with this right now. I'm going to take this guy away. So the chief captain lets Paul talk to the people as they're going up to this, place. So the people talk to people, so he gives his testimony. And he says, look, and he speaks to them in the Hebrew tongue, right? And the people were just like, no, we want him dead. And they were going to kill Paul, but Paul said he was a Roman, and the chief captain backed off and brought him before the council. So the chief captain was like, yo, you guys can have this. If you guys want to kill him, go ahead. But Paul was like, yo, I'm a Roman citizen, and the chief captain was like, all right, we need to do this legitly, because there was a Roman law, you know what I'm saying, just like the Roman law in this country, the same thing. So there was ordinances and whatnot that they had to follow, and one of them was you can't just go out and kill somebody, which Is why Paul was able to go out and to persecute the church, not because of the high priests. It was the high priest acting with other authorities to be able to give Paul the authority to go out and, basically bring people to prison. So the high priest, this is one of the most damning things right here. And you may have already noticed that I'm pointing out all of the things about Paul, and it's because I never noticed these before. I've never heard anybody talk about any of this stuff before, but yet it's been right here in front of our faces the entire time. Literally the entire time. All this information has been right here. We just never got it. Right? So the high priest has him hit, and Paul reacts, right? Cusses him out. And he finds out, and and then he's like, it really sounds like he's mocking the high priest. Just saying. Go read it. But he finds out that with the high priest is Sadducees and Pharisees. So Paul says he's being brought into question because of the resurrection. And I read that, I'm like, what? No, it's not. James confronts him and says everyone is claiming he is teaching Gentiles to forsake the Torah. And right here, he says, there's Pharisees and Sadducees here. Hold up. Hey, I'm being called in question because of the resurrection. And the Sadducees are like, oh, no, he did. Right? And they're like, oh, we were with you, Pharisees. Oh, but now y'all want to talk about the resurrection? Oh, it's about to go down. So it creates a commotion. And it says that what Paul does, divides the multitude. And people started to grab for Paul to rip him in two. To rip Paul in two. And it's like, what? What in the world is going on? This is not the story that I remember. This is not a, what's it called? The anomalies that happen because of CERN, whatever that's called, the Mandela effect, right? This is not a Mandela effect. These have been sitting right here in front of our faces the entire time. But this is crazy. It's like, you kidding me? He just literally lies and manipulates a situation to benefit himself. He said the people warned him that he would go to Jerusalem and get persecuted. That's not what happens. Paul goes to Jerusalem and lies and manipulates the situation, and what happens? The chief priest, the chief captain takes him away, and some Jews made a vow not to eat or drink until Paul was dead. And Paul was warned by Timothy, this is Timothy that warns Paul, and tells the centurion. The chief captain protects Paul with, get this, 470 soldiers. Really? I mean, there must have been a lot of people that made a vow, to be protected by 470. 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen. What? Who is this guy? He's a Roman citizen. You know what I'm saying? Like, yo, let's protect this man. He's supposed to go to Jerusalem to get persecuted, but, yo, we're going to protect him with almost 500 soldiers. Okay? Paul is sent to Felix the governor as Paul appeals to Caesar. So Paul's like, I'm not taking no trial from no Jews. I want to appeal to Caesar. So Paul's taking his all the way to the top. He's going to Rome, to the Caesar, right? And they're like, okay. The chief captain would not judge matters relating to the Torah. So again, we see it coming back to the truth that they were bringing into question matters relating to the Torah, not the resurrection. Paul is taken to Antipatris, he accepted to hear Paul when his accusers come. So Paul is kept in Herod's judgment hall. Now this is interesting because Paul was like put in chains, but he's not really committed a crime. No proof is brought, just accusations, and created this whole ruckus. But when that stuff happens, I don't know if you've ever watched any of the movies with the Romans don't play that stuff. Like, they'll shut that junk down right there because they don't want word getting out that there's an issue, and they send somebody higher up. You know what I'm saying? Like, they try to squash any of that stuff from happening, from taking off before, like, it gets out of control and word gets out that there's a problem there. Because then it'll be a problem for everybody. But anyways, Paul is kept in, but by this point, a lot of that stuff is getting a little starting to get more and more out of hand because it's, later on. But Paul is kept in Herod's judgment hall, which is a room in a palace. We read judgment hall like it's, oh, he's in a prison. Nah, he's in a Herodian palace. Okay. So 5 days later, Ananias the high priest came with the elders, which, if we're using the same words, the elders would be the people that were with James and the elders that we've seen before who confronted Paul. So we have the same, let's say that they're the same people, right? We have James and the elders, which would be John and Peter and, all the rest of the apostles, right? They came and informed the governor against Paul. So if these aren't James and the other apostles, then where are James and the other apostles standing up for Paul and defending Paul? I saw this and I was like, what? The elders came with the high priest? What elders? Are we talking about the elders that were just there? James? The apostles? The apostles come with the high priest and they accuse Paul? Okay. So Paul speaks for a while in his defense. Felix says to wait for the chief captain to come. Felix talks to Paul with his wife, who is a Jew. Felix trembles at what Paul says. And this is weird. So Paul says some stuff to Felix, and it says that Felix trembles at what Paul says. Judgment hall. Oh, judgment hall. So it is a residence which Pilate occupied when he visited Jerusalem. It is a site of Pilate's praetorium, and Jerusalem is given rise to much dispute, some supposing it to be a palace of King Herod, others the Tower of Antinomianism, but it was probably the latter, which was then long afterwards the citadel of Jerusalem. Herod's judgment hall of praetorium in Caesarea was doubtless a part of the magnificent range of buildings, an erection of which King Herod is described in Josephus, the word palace or czar's court. Right. Nice fancy spot. So it said it trembled, the word trembled, right? Paul said some stuff to this guy, Felix, and he trembles, right? The word trembles means to become, come into existence, to receive being, to come to pass, to appear in history, to come on the stage. I'm like, okay, that's just doesn't make any sense. But he trembles at him, at his words, and tells Paul he will call for him when he needs him. So Felix is like, whatever happened, he's like, okay, well, I'm going to call for you when I need you. But it says that Felix leaves Paul, quote-unquote, bound for 2 years in Herod's judgment hall in a palace. Or in a, maybe I'm missing something there, right? I don't know. Judgment hall sounds like a judgment hall, but judgment hall sounds like a palace, according to the Herodians. So Paul's left there for 2 years, and Festus takes over for Felix as governor and goes to Jerusalem. By the way, this is in Judea, so this is where the Herodians would be. So he goes to Jerusalem, or is that in Jerusalem? I don't know. At this point, I'm just like... Anyways, Go read it for yourself. Don't take my word for everything. Festus takes over for Felix as governor and goes to Jerusalem. The high priest and chief Jews tell him about Paul. So he goes back to see Paul and tells the high priest and anyone else that wants to go. So Paul is brought to the judgment seat, and the Jews come and accuse him, but there's no proof, right? There must have not been any letters written at that point. So read Acts 25, 8 through 11. So while Paul said in his own defense, I have committed no offense either against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, are you willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial before me on these charges? So Festus was like, okay, well, I'm governor. If what you're saying is true, that you haven't done anything wrong, right? That you haven't said anything and you haven't been teaching things that are against the temple, against the Torah, or against Caesar. And there he's like, well, will you stand trial in Jerusalem in front of me and the Jews as your accusers? Sounds a very interesting, similar scene, doesn't it? Someone being accused by Jews and standing before the Council of Rome. This sounds very, very familiar. Someone else very prominent in the Bible. Yeah. Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me on these charges? But Paul said, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. I have done no wrong to the Jews, as you also very well know. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. But if none of these things is true, of which these men accuse me, no one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. And he says, to Caesar you shall go. Like, what? I mean, he said he wanted to go to Rome. I guess that's how you get there. He could have just went for a bike ride. So they decide to send Paul to Caesar Augustus. But King Herod Agrippa, comes to meet with Festus, and he tells him about Paul. So King Herod, right, the Herodian, King Herod Agrippa wants to talk to him. Festus presents Paul to Agrippa. There's prominent men, everyone else is there. Paul explains himself. It's very lengthy. And one of the things he tells King Herod Agrippa his testimony on how this all started. And it all started with his vision that he has. Right? So he tells his vision. And when we were fallen to the earth, I heard a voice speaking to me and saying in the Hebrew tongue, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the pricks. And I said, who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus, whom you persecute. He says, but rise and stand upon your feet, for I have appeared unto thee for this purpose, to make you a minister and a witness, both of these things which you have seen, and of those things in which I will appear unto you. Well, which things that he has seen? Delivering you from the people and from the Gentiles, unto whom now I send you, to open their eyes and to turn them from darkness to light, and from the power of Satan unto God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and inheritance among them which are sanctified by faith that is in me. Now that's a whole lot of doctrine, right? There's a lot of doctrinal things in there. But the first things I want to point out is that the purpose that the Messiah supposedly appears to him and says is to make him a minister and a witness, and to deliver him from the people, who I would assume he's saying the Jews and the Gentiles, and to open their eyes, to turn them from darkness to light. This sounds like one of Paul's letters right here. And from the power of Satan unto God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and inheritance among them which are sanctified by faith that is in me. That sounds like a lot of, Paul's things that he teaches, right? But this is what's said in Acts 9 when his vision is recorded for the first time. So he says, "Who are you? It's hard for you to kick against the pricks." And he says, "Go into the city, and it'll be told what to do." Right? So he was blinded. He went into the city. But he says, go thy way, for he is a chosen vessel unto me to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. Okay, kind of what was said later on, right? But it says that, for I will show him how great things he must suffer for my name's sake. And this says, I will deliver you from the Jews and the Gentiles. But over here it says that he will suffer for my name's sake. Not be delivered, but to suffer. But over here it says to be delivered. Those are opposite ends. Being delivered is not suffering. I mean, you could suffer in the moment and then be delivered, but what Paul went through is not suffering. Paul was not persecuted. Paul had people that sought to kill him. Paul had the elders of the church that came and accused him of teaching against the Torah, teaching the Gentiles to forsake the Torah. He had, devout, honorable women and other people who were raised up against him. Like, what? This is crazy, because this is supposedly these are red letters right here. Y'all know what that means, red letters. Red letters that contradict themselves. And unless I'm totally way off base and I'm completely missing something, but to me, being delivered from something and suffering something, they're not the same thing. And there's no doctrinal statements like sanctified by faith, right? There's no doctrinal statements given in Acts 9. So, King Agrippa comes to meet with Festus, tells him about Paul. King Herod Agrippa wants to talk to him. Festus presents Paul to Agrippa. Festus and Agrippa say Paul is not guilty and would go free if he had just accepted, but he accepted to appeal to Caesar. So Paul was sent to Caesar. So this is where Paul goes on the ships. They go around to so many different places. He's supposedly a prisoner, but he's got basically free reign. They stop in places and he's allowed to meet with his people and whatnot. So to me, it doesn't sound like he's much of a prisoner. That's just my viewpoint on it. You can go and read it for yourself. And to me, 27, chapter 27, and about half of chapter 28 is just all these little places they went to, this and that, all these little details. To me, I didn't want to dig into it to try to find something in there that, a deeper meaning somewhere about something. I was just at this point, I was just just dumbfounded by what I've found. I hope that didn't sound dumb. So anyways, he was in a quote unquote shipwreck. It was, seems like it was very near shore. So in verse 16 of chapter 28, the last chapter, they make it to Rome. Finally made it to Rome. So when Paul gets there, he meets with chief Jews and explain why he's there. And they had no clue about anything. They didn't get any letters or anything like that. But they wanted to hear what he has to say. So basically, Acts ends with Paul in Rome in the word that's used is a rented house. So maybe he stayed making tents and rented a house, and he was teaching for 2 years in Rome, just teaching. Like whoever would come and listen, and nobody bothered him. He was in Rome teaching for 2 years, and that's the end of the story. There's no appeal to Caesar, apparently. I don't know. There's a whole lot of interesting things in here that honestly, a lot of the stuff I've come to find answers for. But a lot of the things, which I will want to explain more, hopefully I can do it tomorrow. I want to explain more of these things that I've come to actually find answers for. But some of the stuff I have no clue. I'm like, it doesn't make sense. Things are not adding up, especially in the way that we remember or that, is presented. Just do it. Go do a summary of the book of Acts. I mean, it took me like, a few months to do all this. It's probably been like 5 or 6 months. Maybe not that long, maybe like 5 months. But, just studying and really figuring it out and taking the time to get into, every word and really see what was going on and to put all this together. So this is, whatever, an hour or so from the last 5 months of research. Well, actually, I'll have more tomorrow. But yeah, that's why I called it the Acts of Antinomianism. And I'm going to get into that tomorrow. But the big problem here was Paul is continually, over and over again, brought into question about what he's teaching. And it got to the point where people were just fed up with it. I mean, you had people who were with the elders. Now, the elders, James, John, Peter, the apostles, the disciples, the apostles' disciples, like, all the people, they were like, yo, what are you doing, Paul? What are you teaching these people? We've got all these people, tens of thousands of eyewitnesses, tens of thousands of people right here. You've got men coming in from a different region wanting to kill you. What's going on, man? And that's what I'm saying. What is going on? All these things, they're right here. And I didn't make none of this stuff up. I didn't make any of it up. I didn't go into all the details about some of the more positive things that Paul said. But again, if I tell you, oh, I believe in Jesus, and I go and I'm like, shooting up dope or, hopping cars or whatever, does it matter that I say, oh, I believe in Jesus? No, it don't matter. And so that's kind of why I went the route on presenting this, because I wanted to show, like, Christianity is based on Paul. The Christian doctrine doesn't follow the teachings of the Messiah. It follows the teachings of Paul, who talks a whole lot about stuff that the Messiah does not talk about. And I kind of saw like a problem with that. But then I found all this stuff out, and I was like, yo, I have no problem leaving any man and any man's teaching behind. And I'm sure this will, I'll be called a heretic from numerous people if anybody even watches this. But it is what it is. But you cannot deny all of this information. You can't explain it away. There's people that spend hours and hours and hours and hours explaining what Paul really meant when he wrote his letters. There are people in the Torah community, obviously, because the people in the church just listen to anything that Paul says and create their own religion and their own denomination based on something that Paul says. And, so if you find yourself in the Torah community, right, if you're seeking the ancient ways, the ancient path, the path to righteousness that the scriptures talk about, the Old Testament talks about, if you find yourself in this type of group, you really seriously have to really consider what the implications of this is. And it's very basic. You just reject antinomianism and you adhere to the commandments. I mean, it's that simple. There's nothing major that has to take place. I mean, most, if not all of the people that are in a Torah have come out of the church anyways. So if you've come out of the church, why would you still want to believe or to think that you have any place in the things that the church does? It makes no sense to me. Like, I've been out of the church for like 2 years. I was going to like a Hebrew root type church, a Torah, teaching church, but it was but I stopped going to that one like a year ago, maybe more. But it's been like 2 years plus since I've stepped foot into a Christian church, right? And if I'm walking away from that, why would I read and want to have any part in these things that Christianity and the church system is built upon, which is Paul's letters? Why would I want any part of that anyways? Not to say that's a downright reason to automatically reject everything that this person says, but it's like the book of Acts is key, because in looking into this, I've actually come across, and I've only looked into a couple people's viewpoints in this because I didn't want to pollute my mind with other people's ideas. And I found that people actually notice that there's a big difference between Paul in Acts and Paul in his letters. And they basically just come to the place where they just dismiss the letters, or they dismiss Acts and they accept Paul's letters. So this is nothing new. It has definitely lost its touch, just like Flat Earth or anything like that nature, but I believe this is going to take off like Flat Earth eventually. Because of this video. Praise Yah. Man. But yeah, I mean, this stuff is right here. This is not a Mandela effect. These are things that are right here in front of us. James and the elders confront him about teaching against the Torah. If you're a Christian, this probably does not have much bearing to you. That's super sad to say, but that's reality. But if you're in a Torah community, if you're in Torah, you really have to consider this, because the implications are to dismiss all false teachings, to flee from these things, and to hold to truth. That's what has drawn almost all of us into the Torah community. That's what the remnant Israel is all about. We're all about the truth. That's what you talk to anybody that's involved in these groups. It's people that know about Flat Earth and that know about vaccines and 9/11, all these conspiracy things, but they're not conspiracies. They're, truther topics. And so we get into these things of finding out, deciphering between the lies and the truth. And this is a big one. I think this is more controversial, in a church setting than, Flat Earth or anything else would be. Like, you tell people, you mention, like, oh, I think Paul is a false apostle. They're like, oh, you're gonna burn in hell, you freaking heretic. You know what I'm saying? They like they want to do you like people were trying to do to Paul. And I mean, I haven't tested that out or anything, but I just assumed that would be the case. But I think I'm done rambling, and I'll save the rest for tomorrow. I hope this recorded well. I didn't run a test, anything like that. But praise Yah, He's always good and always blessing me with understanding. I'm just a simple dude. I got a couple daughters and a wife. I got to run a business. Like, I started reading the Bible when I went to prison, and I just immediately was able to point out the nonsense that I saw and what the Bible says. So to me, it was just I've been doing this. I've been doing this ever since I started reading the Bible. I didn't grow up in church and then like have to get unbrainwashed from a lot of different things. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I do know, but I don't know where this is gonna go. I don't know how this is gonna take off. But I would think that it's gonna be something that becomes more mainstream and a lot more popular here in the hopefully coming days. I mean, hey, truth is truth. I didn't write the Bible. I didn't put the books in the Bible. I just read, study, decipher, and seek the Most High to lead me into all truth and to lead me by His Spirit. And like I said, I'm just a regular dude. Whatever. Peace. Shalom, everybody. Hey, if I sent you this video and you're still watching, you're crazy. What are you doing watching this video? You're crazy. Anyways, I hope you do watch this video. I hope you watch it to the very last second, because I do. I spend hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours listening to people. Not so much anymore, but I've spent a long time listening to people. I listen to everything so I can gain an understanding. And it's paid off, because I talk about stuff nobody else talks about. Boom. Shalom, everybody. If you're watching this and you're a Christian, come into Torah, man. Keep the commandments. Like, the pastors of churches is what Isaiah calls the drunkards of Ephraim. Look it up, the book of Isaiah, the drunkards of Ephraim, the pastors of Christianity. Come out of the church, come out of Babylon. Yes, the church, Christianity, is a part of the Babylonian system that the book of Revelation speaks about, and all the other prophetic books that mention it. This is part of the system. Babylon is confusion. Christianity is very confusing. Very, very confusing, which is why it is such a turnoff to the rest of the world. Because Christians are confusing, and for the most part, they're liars and deceivers, and they'll steal from you in business, and they'll do anything and everything else that's bad. Because they don't keep the commandments. That's why. Why don't people go to church? Because there's Christians there. Ha 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 ha. Right? You hear the joke? Why is that? Because the people, and it's a sin problem, a heart problem, not circumcised in the heart. How do you get circumcised in the heart? You come in and listen to the Torah. You listen to the commandments. Shalom.